for which Israel has not been praised enough. 73 war, and remember, many Israeli civilians died. In the Six-Day War, in the 1973 war, and particularly in the 1948 war, where 1% of Israel's population was killed in its war of independence, many of them civilians. And so, these are very, very hard questions. But I am absolutely positive that Israel is going to look very hard at how to avoid civilian casualties. Because as one Western diplomat put it a few years ago, when Hamas kills a civilian Israeli, they win. And when Israel kills a Hamas civilian, Hamas wins. And Israeli planners know that every time they kill a civilian, they lose. They lose in the court of public opinion, they lose on CNN, they lose on BBC, they lose among Israeli civilian citizens, they lose in my estimation. And therefore, more has to be done to reduce civilian deaths. But in the end, Hamas controls this, because by firing rockets from within civilian areas, they induce Israel to respond, and inevitably they know that there'll be a significant number of civilian casualties.
And just to follow up, how do you propose to incentivize Hamas not to carry out those attacks and not to keep trying for those?
I didn't hear that.
So, sorry, how do you propose incentivizing Hamas not to use that style of attack and not to continue evading the civilian issue?
I can tell you one way not to incentivize Hamas is to constantly condemn Israel in a one-sided way, because Hamas knows it's a win-win for them. If they send rockets and Israel responds, they know that Israel is going to be condemned, so why not send rockets? I mean, one of the worst ways of de-incentivizing Hamas is to constantly condemn Israel. The Human Rights Council is probably more responsible for Hamas rockets than almost anybody but Hamas itself. And so you don't de-incentivize by condemning the victims, and that's what's happened in this case.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. In the aftermath of the Gaza conflict, I sat in the Fordham Law School cafeteria, and I had a really wonderful conversation with one of my classmates who happened to be an Arab. And I am an Israeli citizen. And one thing he said to me that struck me was, I'm not an anti-Semite, but I'm an anti-Zionist. And to me that felt like, that means that I don't have a right to live in the home where my family lives, to live safely. I can't really describe how exactly it feels, but I'm interested in your thoughts about how do you reconcile, or not reconcile is the wrong word, but how do you deal with the thought and theory behind Zionism now that the state is formed, and now that we are in so many really complex situations, and does Zionism need to be redefined, or do we need to have a better retort for what exactly anti-Zionism really means?
It's a good question. I think Zionism first has to be defined. It means very many different things to very many different people. I'm a Zionist. I don't live in Israel. I live in the United States. For me, a Zionist, I think that Barack Obama is a Zionist. He believes in Israel's right to exist as a democratic Jewish state, with full rights of its Palestinian, its Christian, its Muslim citizens. That's the most basic definition of Zionism. I walked out of a conference at Ezra Weitzman's home when he was the president of Israel, when he told me, essentially, I wasn't a Zionist because I believed that Jews could thrive in other parts of the world. That's not my kind of Zionism. Zionism is not a promise, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the Jewish people to have a homeland of their own with democratic principles, with no promise how the demographics will work out over time. It must be a democracy. It's a place where Jews can live, hopefully, if the demographics point that way, as a majority, which has a Jewish culture, which has diverse cultures. Of course there are new definitions of Zionism. For example, the law of return was absolutely essential after 1945. By the way, the Palestinians have emulated the law of return, as do many other countries have laws of return allowing their people who are in the diaspora to come in. Tibet has a law of return, at least a hope of a return. But it's now been 65 years since the Holocaust, and redefinition is necessary. There are many post-Zionist young people in Israel who want to remain living in Israel, but they don't hold themselves Zionist. You know, it's a political concept. It's like, what is a socialist, or what is a Democrat with a small c, or what is a libertarian? You know, people have vast disagreements about that. For me, it's enough to say that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish, I reject, by the way, the notion of a Jewish religious state. Herzl was not religious. He said the rabbis should stay in their temples. Ben-Gurion was not religious. Golda Meir was not religious. In fact, Israel's never had a religious leadership, and it's never been a theocracy, but it's had to make compromises with religion because Judaism is a religiously based civilization and a culture. So we can struggle with Zionism. Not all anti-Zionists are anti-Semites, but all anti-Semites are anti-Zionists.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I like to approach this issue from like an international criminal accountability perspective, and it would appear as though if approximately 6 billion people reflected in the General Assembly vote of this world want to pursue some sort of accountability for these actions. And granted, I personally think that it's possible that Justice Goldstone was misled by some of the individuals, but you said yourself that there's 10 incidents, I believe, that warrant investigation. So how can we hold other world leaders accountable in international criminal accountability mechanisms, and yet they see Israel, in their eyes, walking away from these terrible, heartbreaking allegations?
I would turn it exactly on its opposite side. How do you expect any world leaders to respect international human rights when Israel probably ranks among the top 10 compliers with international human rights? If Colonel Kemp is right, number one in terms of how it treats civilians during wartime, and yet it's the only country subjected to a criminal investigation based on its self-defense activities. Nobody will take human rights seriously. The ICC must have a policy of two criteria. First, the worst first. It has to go after, and it's doing it. It's gone after the Sudan first, but if it goes after Israel second, before it goes after Russia and Chechnya, before it goes after many other countries in the world that are far worse violators, the second criteria has to be right in the statute, the Rome Statute. You can only go after countries, even if they've committed war crimes, if they don't have the capacity to investigate, they don't do reasonable investigations of their own. Israel started investigating these charges, literally the days after the war was over. These charges haven't yet, these investigations haven't been complete. The investigations are ongoing. The very idea that Israel would even be in the top 100 countries that are investigated by a criminal court would just undercut human rights forever. It will make everybody understand that human rights is simply another pawn to be played in the political game of condemning the unpopular and the weak. And it just will send a terrible message to world leaders about human rights. It will send a message of exculpatory immunity to the worst human rights offenders. And when you look at the numbers, on any given day, more Muslims are killed by Muslims, terrorist Muslim groups, than by Israel. Look, Jordan has killed more Palestinians than Israel has, and yet there's been no investigation of Jordan. There never would be an investigation of Jordan. And Black September was a massacre. Lebanon has killed more Muslims. Remember that Sabra and Shatila, the killings were not done by Israelis. They were done by phalangists, Lebanese. And yet there have been no investigations of that. So if the International Criminal Court were to investigate these 10 incidents, which Israel is investigating, it would send a terrible message of human rights, violating the principle of the worst first and violating the second principle. If you go after those who have no ability to have internal resolutions, like in Iran. Look what's happening in Iran. A young doctor who was the only person who was a witness to the rapes that occurred after the protests suddenly dies of a heart attack in a prison. Right? You're going to believe that. No investigation of that.